Welcome. You're not here by chance. This channel is a place where history finds its voice. And you just close your eyes. Let the night wrap around you like a forgotten story. We're going back. Back to a time when fear wasn't fiction. It was a way of life for centuries. Humanity has feared one thing above all, that the dead might return, long before vampires were characters in books or TV shows. They were nightmares. A shadow behind the door. The silent cause of illness, plague, and sudden death. People buried their dead with stones on their chests, sewed their burial shrouds shut, nailed coffins closed, not out of reverence, but out of fear. Fear that one day he might open his eyes. So where did this terror begin? And why is it the vampire that still haunts the bloodline of our imagination? Blood has always evoked a dual response in humanity, both sacred reverence and deep fear. On one hand, it symbolized life, energy, the very essence of existence. On the other, it was a reminder of pain, suffering, and death. Perhaps that's why creatures capable of drinking blood instilled such a primal terror. They represented a threat not only to the body, but to the very life force of the human being. Psychologists explain the origin of the vampire myth as a reflection of our deepest fear, the loss of control over our body, our soul, and our very lives. It's an archetype that speaks to the helplessness we feel in the face of aging, illness, and death. Meanwhile, mythologists believe that the image of the blood-drinking creature emerged as an attempt to explain what had long remained unfathomable. Sudden deaths, mysterious epidemics, frightening diseases all demanded an explanation. And so they emerged, beings that existed between worlds. Those who came in the night. Those who took without a trace. Interestingly, tales of bloodsuckers sprang up everywhere, even in the most remote corners of the globe, as if born from darkness itself. Each culture endowed them with its own, often truly horrifying traits, yet one motif remained constant: their bond to death and the hunt under cover of night. Today, we embark on a thrilling journey across epochs and continents. We'll dive into the grim Slavic legends where vampires slipped through village streets under a moonless sky, then venture to Romania, the birthplace of the Blood Prince. There we'll encounter Vlad, the man whose cruelty inspired the myth of Dracula, and finally, we'll unravel an intriguing web of real-life accounts, from rural rituals in which peasants thrust wooden stakes through a corpse's heart, to the first police investigations when superstition collided with the law. This lecture won't merely recount fear and folklore. It will unveil an entire universe in which vampirism mirrors cultural myths, historical realities, and even the medical mysteries of human existence. Vampirism is no mere novelty of folklore, but a phenomenon whose roots stretch back to the dawn of civilization. Even the Sumerians settled on the fertile plains of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, two mighty rivers rising in the mountains of modern Turkey and flowing into the Persian Gulf, more than 4,000 years ago, believed in formless demons and spirits that crept into homes by night, tormenting the living and draining their life force. Among them, the Ekemu and Utuku stood out as especially sinister, merciless shadows of the dead, doomed to wander beneath the moonlit sky in search of fresh blood. To protect themselves, people carved incantations onto clay tablets, left offerings of bread and beer at their thresholds, and whispered secret prayers, hoping to bind the restless beyond the veil. In ancient Egypt, myth and ritual intertwined even more closely. A botched mummification or broken sacred rite could awaken the spirits of the deceased's vital life force, sustained by offerings, and the soul personality that could roam between the living and the dead, thirsting to reclaim flesh and blood. Thus, in the human psyche was born the archetype of the night predator, or ruthless hunter, whose shadow drifts between worlds, showing no mercy. One of the most astonishing chapters in ancient myth is the tale of the goddess Sekhmet the Fierce, warrior and sole daughter of the sun god Ra. According to legend, humanity had so defiled the sacred order that Ra, in boundless fury, summoned his child to earth. Sekhmet, with the head of a predator and a heart ablaze with unbridled rage, unleashed relentless destruction. Her thirst for blood streamed forth like rivers of agony. Cities crumbled, and what remained of humankind braced for extinction until Ra himself decided to save his creation. Yet only a cunning ruse could tame his daughter's fury. The god commanded vast vats to be filled with dark beer, dyed the color of fresh wine, and when Sekhmet, blinded by the sight of crimson blood, plunged into a drunken feast, her savage spirit finally subsided, yielding to a deep, dreamless slumber. This legend is far more than a dramatic account of divine wrath. It casts blood as the purest source of life, and the goddess's consumption of it embodies humanity's ancient dread of plagues, divine punishment, and the inevitability of death. Here we hear the opening chords of the classic vampire motif, an insatiable craving for life force, the image of the nocturnal predator, and the necessity of magical rites for protection. Long before literary Draculas and silver screen monsters, people conjured their own blood drinkers to give shape to their deepest fears and hopes. It is these primordial myths that laid the very foundation for what we now call the phenomenon of vampirism. As we move further into the world of ancient Greece and Rome, we see how bloodsuckers took on new, even darker and more dramatic forms, which seems surprisingly familiar to our modern perception. While in Eastern cultures, they were seen as demons and embodiments of divine wrath, in Greece and Rome, these creatures developed tragic destinies and complex characters. First, we encounter Empusa, the offspring of the dark goddess Highgate. By night, she would glide along roads, transforming into an enchanting stranger to seduce travelers and quench her thirst for blood. In her legends lies the ancient terror of the heartlessness of the dark and deceptive beauty, where behind every charm lurks a deadly trap. Even more horrifying was Lamia, once the queen of Libya and the lover of Zeus, who lost her children by the vengeful order of Hera. The blind pain of her loss drove Lamia mad, and in her madness she became a bloodthirsty predator, hunting down the lives of other people's children, hoping to briefly revive the feeling of maternal love. Her ability to change form allowed her to slip into homes unnoticed and claim innocent lives. Finally, Strix, the fearsome night bird with a piercing cry that foretold death for infants and the sick. In ancient texts, she was described as the winged shadow of death, one that could not be driven away by any spells. These myths show us that, even in the era of antiquity, the vampire figure had already absorbed human tragedies and fears, laying the foundation for the night predator that still haunts our imagination today. As we move further into the world of ancient Greece and Rome, we see how bloodsuckers took on new, even darker and more dramatic forms, which seemed surprisingly familiar to our modern perception. While in Eastern cultures, they were seen as demons and embodiments of divine wrath. In Greece and Rome, These creatures developed tragic destinies and complex characters. It was from Strix that the Eastern European word Strigoi would later emerge. The seed of the vampire myth, as we know it, Empusa, Lamia, Strix, not just monsters, symbols of seduction, madness, and death. And together, they laid the foundation for the vampire, the night predator, who is as tragic as they are terrifying. Not just a hunter, but a reflection of everything we fear and everything we desire. These myths show us that, even in the era of antiquity, the vampire figure had already absorbed human tragedies and fears, laying the foundation for the night predator that still haunts our imagination today. Having explored the ancient roots of vampire myths, we now move closer to home into the dark heart of Slavic tradition, into the world of Vurdalaks and Strigois, where myth merges with real fears and the rituals of daily life. In ancient Slavic culture, vampirism took on vivid and uniquely haunting forms, embodied in the figure we now call the Vurdalak. But the image our ancestors feared was nothing like the romanticized, elegant vampire we imagine today. The Vurdalak was no refined, mysterious noble cloaked in charm. He was a terrifying, disheveled corpse risen from the grave to torment his loved ones, to destroy the quiet rhythm of village life. Slavs believed that anyone who died a wrong or unclean death could return as one. A suicide, an executed criminal, a plague victim, or someone struck down by violence. Even those who hadn't received the proper burial rites or were cursed in life were seen as possible revenants. These beliefs weren't just superstition, they shaped real, desperate rituals meant to protect the living from the dead. One of the most chilling practices was to bury the corpse face down, in hopes the dead would become disoriented and unable to rise. To ensure they stayed buried, people drove aspen stakes through the heart, placed heavy stones over the chest, or wedged rocks in their mouths, anything to bind them to the world of the dead. And these weren't just legends. Archaeologists continue to uncover such graves across Eastern Europe, grim evidence of just how real these fears once were, and how deeply they shaped the way people lived and died. One of the most chilling elements of Slavic vampire legends was the belief that the dead didn't just rise, they came home. In the dark of night, they would return to their former houses, calling out in familiar voices. A mother's tone, a brother's whisper, a child's plea. They begged to be let inside, and those who gave and moved by compassion, nostalgia, or fear sealed their own fate. Illness followed, death, and then the inevitable transformation into the same kind of monster. This haunting detail gave the Slavic myths an unsettling realism. These weren't fairy tales, they were living fears, woven into everyday life, passed down in whispers. And sometimes those fears grew so large that even the authorities took notice. One of the most infamous cases took place in 1726 in the Serbian village of Medvedja. A Christian man named Arnold Payol died under ordinary circumstances, but soon after, people in the village began dying from a mysterious illness. Panic spread. Locals were convinced Arnold had returned from the grave to prey on the living. The fear became so widespread that Austrian officials launched a formal investigation, one of the first government-led inquiries into a suspected case of vampirism. When they exhumed Payol's body, the sight shocked them. It was perfectly preserved, and worse, His lips were stained with fresh blood. Tio calmed the villagers and ended the hysteria. They drove a wooden stake through his heart and burned his body. But even that wasn't the end. Several more graves were opened in the following days and met the same gruesome fate. The incident made headlines across Europe. For the first time, the myth of the vampire wasn't just a story, it was official business, and like the romantic, elegant vampires of modern fiction, the Slavic Vurdalak was something far more terrifying. Not a noble predator, but a decaying corpse risen from the grave. It embodied real fears of sudden death, of disease, of what might crawl out of the dark when the sun goes down and knock on your door using the voice of someone you loved. So, the Slavic image of the Vurdalak and the real-life stories surrounding it had little in common with the romantic, mysterious vampires of modern fiction. These creatures weren't tragic anti-heroes or seductive immortals. They were raw reflections of everyday terror. They rose from graves not to charm, but to torment. They embodied the primal fear of sudden death, incurable disease, and strange nighttime visitations no one could explain. For the people of that time, these weren't legends, they were warnings whispered from grave to cradle, from shadow to firelight, and in a world where the line between life and death often blurred. Those whispers felt all too real. Next, we journey into the heart of Transylvania, the old land of Romania, a place where stones remember blood and trees whisper the names of the long departed, though perhaps not entirely gone. For centuries, this land has been a battleground of wars, disasters, sickness, and oblivion. People here lived as if on the edge, breathing today, buried tomorrow. And in this fragile reality, where logic holds no power, a myth was born, a creature whose name is still whispered in corners. The Strigoi. This is no movie vampire with a cloak and polished fangs. No, a Strigoi is someone who died wrong, wicked in life, cursed, or taken before their time. And now they return, not as a romantic stranger, but as a rotting shadow that taps on your window in the dead of night. They say Strigoi can take the shape of animals, bring disease, and speak with the storm. But the most terrifying part they remember. They remember everyone who turned them away, who ignored them, who dared to doubt. And when they return, it's not just for blood. It's to settle the score. In a village hidden deep among the Carpathian hills, a miller died. He had been greedy, grim, and strangely ageless. When he finally passed, the villagers breathed a sigh of relief. But it didn't last long. The first night was still. Even the birds were silent. On the second, dogs began to howl, though the sky was clear. And on the third, the wind howled like it had torn through another world, and footsteps were heard. Beneath the windows, the elders knew what to do. Garlic, silver, bolted shutters. Only the blacksmith, the man who worked with fire and iron, took a stake carved from ash and headed for the graveyard. There, under the moonlight, the earth on the miller's grave began to stir, as if breathing. And when his hand broke through the soil, the blacksmith drove the stake straight into his heart. The scream that followed seemed to come from the earth itself. By morning, only the torn open grave remained, the body still, eyes frozen in rage, and an ashen stake lodged in its chest. Since then, the miller never returned. But in every Romanian village, they still say, death is not the end. Sometimes it's only the beginning of something far more terrifying. These stories have been passed down for centuries, becoming an inseparable part of village life. They kept alive the fear of unseen forces and reminded people, only by following the old rites and taboos could misfortune be held at bay. That's why the Strigoi is more than a frightening tale in Romania. It is a living piece of collective memory, where fear, belief, and tradition remain bound together to this very day. Now, having explored the Romanian image of Strigoi and Slavic Vurdalaks, let's move on to the next part of our lecture, where we will meet the historical figure who became the prototype for the most famous vampire in human history, Vlad, known as Dracula. Myths and real events intertwine in the story of Vlad, a man whose name became synonymous with cruelty and terror. Before the fictional vampire created by Bram Stoker conquered the world, there was a real man whose reign left a mark on history. This man was far from an ordinary ruler. Vlad III, or as he was called, Vlad, turned out to be one of the most terrifying and mysterious leaders of the 15th century. Vlad was born in 1431 in the city of Sighisoara to the family of Prince Vlad II. His father, a member of the Order of the Dragon, was a guardian of the Christian world, fighting against the advancing Ottoman Empire. The nickname Dracula meant son of the dragon and symbolized his connection to this order, but over time, it took on a dark, sinister meaning that became forever tied to Vlad's name. Vlad's fate was sealed from the very beginning. At a young age, he was taken captive by the Ottomans, a harsh school, where he learned to survive in a world where the weak were not welcome. It was not just a political captivity. It was a school of ruthless struggle for life that shaped his psyche. Vlad learned to value only strength, fear, and determination. Upon returning home, he set himself the goal of becoming a ruler who would tolerate neither weakness nor betrayal. But the greatest mystery in this story of Vlad is his cruelty. He became famous for his method of punishment, impaling. This execution, which could hardly have been seen as unusual in those times when the struggle for power was so brutal, became his trademark. However, strangely enough, his actions were not just an expression of personal sadism. They served a political purpose to terrify his enemies. For Vlad, the war for the throne and power was a fight for survival, and if he needed to instill fear to protect his country and family, he did not hesitate. One of the darkest chapters in Vlad's history occurred in 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II, with a huge army moving toward Wallachia, encountered what we might today call a psychological attack. Vlad ordered the execution and impalement of 20,000 Turkish prisoners to alarm the Ottoman army. This bloody scene of thousands of bodies lining the roads so shook the enemies that they retreated, unwilling to continue the war. This episode became a striking example of how terrifying fear can defeat even strength. Vlad's cruelty was not limited to his enemies. He was just as merciless toward his own subjects. Written sources describe his methods of governance as dictatorial and brutal. All who fell out of his favor, including local boyars, were subjected to terrible punishments. One of the most famous examples was the mass execution of the upper classes, whom he suspected of treason. According to some reports, after one of his feasts, he ordered the execution of an entire group of nobles, removing all possible competitors. However, all this cruelty was part of a strategy. In a time when every small principality risked becoming A victim of stronger neighbors, harsh measures became the only way to maintain independence and power. It was hardly possible to survive otherwise in a world full of threats and betrayals. Vlad was a master of terror, and the fear he sowed became his main political strength. It is hard to say whether Vlad was the monster he was portrayed as. We see in him not just a ruler, but a man subjected to cruel upbringing and circumstances, for whom any means were acceptable in order to survive. And it was on these grounds that he became the basis for the fictional vampire whose name became a symbol of evil. The literary Dracula became a distorted yet powerful metaphor for fear, embodying all the horrors and mysticism of that time. Thus, Vlad turned out to be not just a man who became a legend, but a hero of a myth that survived centuries. His life story is not just a tale of cruelty, but a warning about how far a person can go when desperately fighting for their power and their land. How did a ruthless 15th century warlord become the most mysterious vampire in literary history? Many believe Bram Stoker simply took the real-life figure of Vlad the Impaler and gave him fangs. But the truth is far more intriguing and much darker. Stoker didn't just copy history. He performed alchemy. He wove together forgotten myths, sinister legends, and ancient whispers from the edges of Europe. Yes, he first encountered the name Dracula in an old book by William Wilkinson, a historical account of Wallachia and Moldavia, published in 1820. It mentioned Vlad's brutal deeds. But that was just the spark, the true fire of inspiration. Burned in far older, more haunting sources, one lesser known but truly fascinating fact: Irish legends had a powerful influence on Dracula's character. Growing up with the folklore of his homeland, Stoker would have known of the red bloodsucker, a beautiful woman betrayed in life who returned from the grave to feed on the living in vengeance. In her lived revenge, tragic love, and silent horror, all of which shaped the soul of Dracula. Then came the chilling tales of Eastern Europe, a land steeped in superstition, viewed by 19th century Westerners as almost otherworldly. Stoker himself never set foot in Romania. Every detail in his novel was born from imagination, nourished by travelogues and the velvet dread of Gothic style. To the Victorian reader, it was the perfect mix of the exotic and the terrifying. S.O. Stoker didn't just create a character, he forged a myth. From scraps of history, folklore, fear, and desire. From decaying graves buried deep in the Balkan forests. From ancient Irish tales and a restless, changing Europe. His Dracula was not born from a single story, but from a chorus of voices whispering of blood and immortality. That's why he became eternal. Today, historians believe that most so-called cases of vampirism were actually rooted in misunderstood illnesses. Not immortal creatures rising from graves, but diseases that baffled even the doctors of the time: tuberculosis. People grew pale, weak, withered before the eyes of their loved ones, as if someone or something was draining their life at night. Then there was catalepsy, a rare condition that made a person appear completely dead while they were actually in a deep trance. Some corpses awoke in their coffins, scratching at the wood, gasping for breath. And just like that, legends were born of the dead returning to life. Some of these stories were so striking, they made headlines. Like the case of Angelo Hayes in France, declared dead and buried in haste due to catalepsy. He was exhumed days later when his family felt Something wasn't right. Inside the coffin, they found him alive, barely conscious, but alive. These chilling incidents fed a growing panic. People feared not only vampires, but being buried alive. Across Europe, safety coffins were invented equipped with bells, tied to the wrist of the deceased. If a buried person woke up, they could ring for help. Thus was born the eerie tradition of the grave bell. A faint chime from below could mean someone was still alive. The vampire hysteria of the 18th century wasn't just a wave of superstition. It was a mirror of its time, a time when death lurked around every corner, and science couldn't explain it all. In the absence of answers, people turned to myth, and vampires became the explanation and outlet for the fear of disease, death, and the unknown. Even rational minds, like that of monk Augustine Comet, unintentionally fueled the fire. His treatise on spirits and vampires, written with a scholar's rigor, gave supernatural tales the illusion of legitimacy. Now that we've explored the roots of the hysteria, it's time to descend deeper into the dark underbelly of this phenomenon, into the real vampire hunts, the manuals, the sharpened stakes, into the nights when even governments and police were forced to investigate attacks that couldn't be explained by anything human. The history of vampires and belief in their existence did not end with a wave of mass panics in the 18th century. On the contrary, these fears transformed, evolved, and resurfaced in new and often unexpected forms. By the 19th, and especially the early 20th century, the theme of vampirism hadn't disappeared. It had simply stepped out of folklore and into the realms of culture, pseudoscience, and even religious discourse. One of the most vivid, controversial, and truly extraordinary figures to emerge from this period was an English priest, scholar, and writer named Montague Somers, born in 1880. Somers was no ordinary clergyman. While he was ordained and claimed deep religious convictions, his true passion lay elsewhere in the supernatural, the forbidden, and the occult. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who dismissed tales of vampires as knave peasant superstitions, Somers believed with unwavering sincerity that vampires were real. Not metaphorically real, literally, dangerously, and actively present in the world of the living. He devoted his life to the study of the arcane, the mystical, and the malevolent. Vampires, werewolves, witches, demons, necromancy, these were not simply intellectual curiosities for Somers. They were tangible forces, threats that demanded both spiritual and physical defense. And it was the vampire, above all, that became the central figure of his research and his personal crusade. In 1928, he published what would become his most famous and influential book, The Vampire, His Kith and Kin. In it, Somers compiled a vast collection of historical records, church documents, and eyewitness testimonies. He analyzed folklore from Eastern Europe, the Balkans, France, Germany, and the British Isles, highlighting striking similarities across cultures that, in his eyes, served as undeniable proof of a real global phenomenon. To Somers, the vampire wasn't just a myth, it was a consistent, observable entity lurking behind centuries of horror. His descriptions of vampires were thorough and precise. He outlined the signs: pale skin, nocturnal habits, the sudden, unexplained deaths of those around them, bite marks on the neck, fear of sunlight, and violent reactions to religious icons. He urged his readers to be vigilant, to recognize the signs, and to understand that such creatures were not confined to fiction or distant lands. They could be next door, but Montague Summers didn't stop at classification. He wrote with the urgency of a man convinced that humanity was under siege. His books served not just as investigations, but as manuals for survival. He detailed methods for protection, how to properly drive a wooden stake through the heart, the correct use of holy water, the arrangement of crucifixes, and the importance of ritual prayer. He combined ancient rites with Christian doctrine, asserting that only a blend of physical and spiritual defense could keep the forces of darkness at bay. His sincerity was infectious. Inspired by his works, many Europeans and Americans began to take the threat seriously. Thus emerged a truly bizarre cultural artifact of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the vampire hunting kit. These were not novelty items. Crafted with care and often sold at great expense to wealthy clients, these kits were presented in leather-bound or velvet-lined cases. Inside, one could find a finely carved wooden stake and mallet, silver or iron crucifixes, glass vials labeled holy water, rosaries, miniature Bibles, handwritten prayers, and sometimes even pistols loaded with silver bullets. Garlic sachets, mirror fragments, and protective talismans were often included as well. These weren't movie props, they were real items, sold to real people, many of whom believed they might one day face a vampire and would need to be prepared to fight for their lives. Today, original vampire hunting kits have become collectors' treasures. Auctioned for astonishing prices, they serve as tangible relics of a bygone-era, evidence of the very real fear that once gripped even educated modern societies. Montague Summers, though often ridiculed by scholars of his time, left an undeniable mark on the cultural and intellectual landscape. His absolute conviction, his scholarship, and his refusal to see vampires as mere fantasy helped shape public fascination with the undead. He wasn't just a chronicler of myths, he was a believer, a defender, and in many ways, a prophet of darkness. Even now, when we read Gothic novels, binge horror films, or explore vampire lore, the echo of Summers's voice can still be heard. His shadow looms over our most primal fears. And perhaps that is the most chilling legacy of all, that one man's belief in the monster was enough to make the world believe again. Though today tales of vampires may seem like relics of a distant past, even the 20th century saw official authorities grappling with reports of the supernatural. One of the most chilling and widely publicized cases didn't happen in some remote village, but right in the heart of London, on the grounds of Highgate Cemetery in the early 1970s. What began as whispers quickly turned into a full-blown legend. Residents of the Highgate area started reporting strange, unsettling occurrences on the grounds of the old cemetery, one of the capital's most famous necropolises. Witnesses claimed to see a tall, shadowy figure gliding silently between the gravestones and crypts. He wore a long, dark cloak. His skin was deathly pale, and his eyes, according to some, glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Some said he floated above the ground. Others swore he vanished into thin air. Fear spread through the community like wildfire. So many reports flooded in that the police were forced to launch an official investigation. Night patrols were deployed. Eyewitnesses were interviewed, and investigators searched for any rational explanation. One theory suggested the so-called vampire might actually be a disturbed individual, someone performing occult rituals or simply trying to terrify the neighborhood. Yet, despite their efforts, police found no solid evidence. No suspect was ever caught. And so, with nothing to go on, the case was quietly closed, but the story didn't end there. The legend of the Highgate vampire only grew stronger. Paranormal enthusiasts, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers began flocking to the cemetery, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous figure that had haunted the city's imagination. This wasn't medieval folklore. It was a modern mystery, tangled with headlines, official police files, and the lingering fear that something truly unexplainable had stalked the streets of post-war Britain. And though the Highgate vampire was never found, the terror he inspired was undeniably real. Equally disturbing and astonishing events were unfolding across the ocean in the United States of America. Though they occurred earlier in the mid-19th century, they were no less gripping. One of the most well-documented and chilling episodes of the so-called vampire panic in America was the notorious case of the Brown family from Rhode Island. We'll return to that story shortly, but first, let's focus on a lesser-known, yet equally telling incident that took place in 1854 in the small village of Jewett City, Connecticut. It all began with a strange and terrifying epidemic that swept through the village. One by one, people began to waste away, weakening rapidly, fading as if some unseen force was slowly draining the life from them. Their loved ones, powerless to help, could only watch in horror as their family members withered before their eyes. With no medical explanation available, the terrified townsfolk turned to folklore for answers, and their suspicions soon fell on the recently deceased. Whispers of vampirism began to spread. Panic took hold. People came to believe that the dead were not truly at rest, that they were rising from their graves at night to feed on the life essence of the living. As hysteria grew, local officials and even clergy were pressured into taking action. An official exhumation of several graves was authorized in hopes of finding out the truth. What they uncovered only deepened the fear. Some of the bodies showed little to no signs of decomposition. For the villagers, this was all the proof they needed. These were not ordinary corpses. These were vampires, unable to calm the public's growing terror by reason alone. The authorities relented. A ritual was arranged. The disinterred bodies were burned, and the remains were buried, an act which, according to local beliefs, would neutralize the threat of vampirism and halt the spread of death. These proceedings were documented by local newspapers and state archives, and remain among the last officially recorded vampire-related exhumations in American history. Both the incident in Connecticut and the later case in Rhode Island demonstrate a haunting truth. The belief in vampires was not confined to the distant Middle Ages. Even in the age of steam engines and telegraphs, the fear of something dark and unnatural clawing its way from the grave still lingered in the hearts of many. Even in the most progressive countries, during the Age of Enlightenment and scientific advancements, people remained ready to believe in the return of the dead and take entirely unusual, sometimes even official measures to protect themselves from these terrifying creatures. The belief in vampires did not vanish despite scientific progress and continued to hold people captive with its mystical power. Over the centuries, various explanations have been offered for this belief, and events once perceived as supernatural occurrences have gradually received more rational scientific explanations. Modern scientists have identified several diseases that once served as the foundation for vampire myths. One of the most well-known is porphyria, a rare hereditary disorder in which the body is unable to properly produce hemoglobin. The main symptom of this disease is an unusual and painful sensitivity to sunlight. Even a brief period outdoors can cause severe burns and ulcers on the skin. The face and limbs of those affected become covered in scars and blisters, and their skin takes on a painfully pale hue, which immediately raises suspicion and fear among others. But perhaps the strangest aspect of porphyria is the deformation of the gums in affected individuals, causing their teeth to become elongated and resemble fangs, much like the mythical vampires. People with this condition typically avoid daylight, leading a nocturnal lifestyle, which gave rise to numerous rumors. In the Middle Ages and beyond, when science and medicine were in their infancy, such individuals easily fell victim to superstition. Their unusual symptoms were seen as clear signs of vampirism, and society often regarded them as monsters, leading to fear and ostracism from those around them. Mysterious diseases, such as tuberculosis and rabies, had just as powerful an influence on the formation of vampire myths, leaving a deep mark in the folklore of various cultures. Tuberculosis, once known as consumption, was one of the most terrifying diseases of its time. It caused sharp weight loss, deadly pallor, severe weakness, and bloody coughs in those affected. The disease could develop rapidly, wiping out entire families in just a few months, creating the fear that one of the deceased might be returning to take their loved ones. In villages plagued by the epidemic, people sometimes began exhuming graves in search of the cause of the terrifying affliction. Often, bodies were found that, for some reason, had not decomposed fully, which only strengthened the locals' belief in the reality of vampires coming to claim their victims. However, it wasn't just tuberculosis that created an atmosphere of fear and mysticism. Rabies, considered especially frightening due to its rapid progression, was also frequently linked to myths about the supernatural. People bitten by rabid animals became aggressive, experienced a painful reaction to light, began exhibiting nocturnal activity, and often fell into seizures accompanied by convulsions. Such behavior easily aligned with depictions of vampires, and rabies sufferers could be seen as sinister creatures attacking people and infecting them with their curse. Furthermore, victims of rabies often bit others, spreading the disease, which only intensified the terror in society and fueled rumors of vampire attacks, spreading horror among the living. The speed of the disease's spread, its catastrophic consequences, and symptoms resembling those in vampire myths led to panic, prompting people to seek supernatural explanations for what was happening. One of the most striking and well-documented stories that highlights deep fears and mystical beliefs in vampires occurred in 1892 in Rutland, USA, and is linked to the tragic tale of the Brown family. This case became the embodiment of how unexplained diseases can give rise to terrifying legends, and medical ignorance can lead to the most unreasonable decisions. In the small town of Exeter, it all began when the mother of the Brown family passed away, followed by her eldest daughter. Soon, the youngest son, Edwin, fell gravely ill, literally wasting away before their eyes, suffering from severe coughing and weakness. The local residents quickly reached a terrifying conclusion: the illness was caused by supernatural interference, specifically that one of the recently deceased family members had risen from the grave to drain the last remaining strength of the living relatives. Suspicion fell on 19-year-old Mercy, who had died from the same mysterious illness not long before. Despite vehement protests from doctors, the townspeople insisted on exhuming her body, certain they would find signs of vampirism. When the grave was opened, the townspeople were stunned. The body of the girl, buried in the winter in a cold tomb, had hardly decomposed, and most disturbingly, fresh blood was allegedly found in her heart. This was taken by the locals as irrefutable evidence that Mercy had truly returned from the dead as a vampire. In a panic and desperate for a solution, they decided to perform a special ritual to rid themselves of the curse. The girl's heart was removed, burned right at the cemetery, and the ashes were dissolved in water, which they made Edwin drink, hoping that this would cure him. However, their hopes were in vain. Edwin soon died, as did the rest of his relatives. The cause of these deaths was not vampirism, but rather tuberculosis, a disease that at the time could not be fought off with such methods. This tragic case drew the attention of the entire American press, becoming one of the last recorded episodes related to vampire superstitions in the United States. The story of Mercy Brown became one of the vivid examples of how fear of the unknown and diseases can lead to tragic and fantastical consequences, destroying lives and giving rise to myths that continue to captivate the imagination to this day. Many still believe that the belief in vampires and all the associated myths have long disappeared, left somewhere in the dark ages of the Middle Ages, or at least in the last century. But reality turns out to be much more surprising and layered. The image of vampires has not only not disappeared, but has taken on new forms, sometimes much stranger and scarier. Today, we face a phenomenon known as modern vampirism. This is a mysterious subculture that brings together people who sincerely believe they are real vampires, needing human blood or a specific life force to exist. Modern vampires no longer hide in the shadows of the night or the darkness of dark streets. They actively live their lives in open communities, gathering in clubs and cafes, organizing meetups, and even hosting balls such as the famous annual Vampire Ball in New Orleans. It's no longer just darkness and mystery. Vampires openly communicate, discuss their feelings, and find support among like-minded individuals. Some are convinced that their physical need for blood consumption is not associated with violence, but rather with the idea that blood gives them extraordinary strength and energy that they cannot obtain in any other way. Modern science, of course, explains this phenomenon as part of a psychological condition known as Renfield syndrome, named after the character from Bram Stoker's famous novel. People suffering from this syndrome feel an irresistible urge to consume blood, believing that it brings them incredible strength, youth, or even immortality. This is a mental disorder that is actively studied by specialists. Psychologists explain it is a result of internal conflicts, unresolved trauma, and deep emotional deficits. However, not all members of the modern vampire community engage in blood consumption. Alongside this, there is what is called energy vampirism, where people feel the need to feed not on physical blood, but on the emotions and energy of others. These individuals often seek to evoke strong emotions in those around them, be it fear, irritation, or pity, so they can feed off the energy they receive. And despite the fact that this phenomenon seems rather unusual, it occurs far more often than we might think and is actively studied by psychologists. Modern vampires are actively working to break the stereotypes of violence and crime associated with their lifestyle. They emphasize that their rituals are not only safe, but also strictly regulated, from medical checks to respecting consent and personal boundaries of participants. For them, vampirism has become not just a subculture, but a genuine way of self-expression and the pursuit of inner harmony. For many, it's even a form of therapy, a path to self-discovery and healing from old unspoken emotional wounds. Modern vampires do not hide their essence. They openly declare their existence and that their way of life is not just a whim or fiction, but an important part of their self-identity and life philosophy. Today, we embarked on an intriguing journey through myths and real history, seeking to understand how one of humanity's most mysterious and captivating figures has evolved from ancient demons and gods to medieval fears, from Vlad to modern communities of people who identify as vampires. We've discovered how deep and diverse the roots of this phenomenon truly are. The history of vampires is a mirror reflecting our deepest fears, hopes, and attempts to explain the unexplainable. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you at our next lectures.